So I thought we'd start with the most important thing when it comes to baking sourdough bread, and that is maintaining your sourdough starter. Since fermentation is such a cornerstone of baking, it's important that your starter is strong and healthy. And I always like to say that a strong and healthy starter means you'll have great bread. So when it comes to maintaining your sourdough starter, we'll look at the frequency at which you feed it and how that will affect its fermentation. We'll look at the flour choices you have, things that you might have in your pantry, what flours I like and which ones have worked best for me, and some other options for you to use depending on what flour you might be baking with. Then we'll look at the temperature at which your starter is kept at and how that affects fermentation. And from there, we'll look at the various signs that you might look for in determining when your sourdough starter is ripe each day. So that's the visual signs, the change in aroma, and the change in consistency. Then we'll look at sourdough starter ratios, so what it means to have a certain amount of flour, water, and ripe carryover at each feeding, and how we can adjust those, which ratios I like best as well. And finally, we'll talk about a bunch of questions and answers that have come in over the past 10 years that I've helped bakers maintain their starter, and also the things that I've found best and some misconceptions when it comes to me feeding my own sourdough starter. So the first thing I want to look at is the most important bit, and that is how I like to maintain my sourdough starter and how my maintenance routine might help you in your kitchen. So the first things first, you want to discard a large portion of your fermented starter. And here it looks like I have quite a lot because my starter is usually a little bit larger than most people's. That's because I bake so often and I need quite a bit of discard. I like to use the spatula to scrape down the sides and make sure that the jar is as clean as I can get it. And I also use a reusable cloth here to kind of wipe down the top portion of the jar to keep it clean. This is where starter usually gets kind of gunked up and caked on. You can see there's only a little bit of starter left in the jar here. Place it on your scale and start scooping in your flour. Here I'm going to add 30 grams of whole grain rye flour. And this is pretty thirsty flour for me. This is stone ground rye. And to that, I'm going to add 70 grams of all-purpose white flour or medium protein bread flour. So once you have 70 grams of white flour and 30 grams of rye, add your 100 grams of water. I like to keep my water at room temp. Usually my kitchen's pretty warm. If your kitchen's cooler, you can always warm your water. Then use your spatula and give it a good stir. I like to make sure that there are no dry bits of flour left in the mixture, so keep stirring until everything's nice and incorporated. And again, use the spatula to kind of clean the sides and scrape everything down towards the bottom. At the end of stirring, you'll see that your starter is pretty shaggy at the bottom there, and it's not very tall. There's only a little bit left in there, but by the end of its fermentation timeline, it'll have risen quite a bit. Put the lid on top and it's good for 12 hours. And that's all there is to it. You just discard down your starter, add fresh flour and water, and give it a good mix. And I do this twice per day. Let's now talk about feeding frequency and how often you should feed your sourdough starter. I like to feed mine twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening. And the reason I do that is it gives me two opportunities for which I can bake that day or the next day. For instance, in the morning at 9 a.m., if I decide I want to bake that day, I can make a levain that ripens quickly throughout the day and use it to mix directly into a batch of dough. Alternatively, I can make a levain at night that ripens for 12 hours overnight, and I can start mixing for that day's bake first thing in the morning. So those two feedings are convenient for me, but if you find yourself only wanting to feed your sourdough starter once per day to fit your schedule, that's totally fine. You can feed it once in the morning at 9 a.m. or once in the evening at 9 p.m., for example. Whatever works for you. I like to use a mixture of whole grain rye flour and all-purpose white flour to feed my sourdough starter. The whole grain rye flour brings a lot of enzymatic and fermentation activity, a lot of flavor, and the all-purpose flour provides a way for me to visually inspect the signs of fermentation through the day. So the white flour helps me see the sourdough starter rise and fall. It helps me see some bubbles and gas trapping within the dough. And it is also a way of kind of tempering fermentation so that my sourdough starter doesn't become overly acidic with the ratios that I use and the temperatures I keep it at. However, you can use any flour you have that you use for baking and that's in your pantry for feeding your sourdough starter. Over the years, I've used everything from einkorn to Khorasan to freshly milled whole wheat to just rye flour. Any of those will work, and it's really up to you and the style of baking that you find yourself doing more often. As far as temperatures, I prefer to keep my sourdough starter at a pretty warm temperature, between 74 and 76 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature and the amount of sourdough starter that I leave in the jar, it means that my sourdough starter ripens in about 12 hours. So that's perfect for my schedule that I mentioned earlier. I'd feed it at 9 a.m. and 12 hours later at 9 p.m., it's ripe and ready for a feeding. One technique for slowing down fermentation in your starter is to find a cooler spot in your kitchen or use cooler water at each feeding. And the opposite is true. If your sourdough starter is very sluggish and you find that it takes too long to ripen, then you might want to use warmer water or find a warmer spot in your kitchen to increase fermentation activity and reduce the amount of time between feedings. Let's talk about the signs that I look for when I try to determine whether my sourdough starter needs a feeding. I like to use a combination of things: the aroma, look, consistency, and my knowledge of the schedule that I'm on and the season that I'm currently in. In terms of consistency, upon first feeding your sourdough starter, you'll notice it's just kind of a shaggy lump of dough. Over time, as it ferments, it'll get looser and looser. And that loosening of consistency is a good sign that fermentation is taking place. In terms of bubbles, I like to see bubbles on the side, especially if I have some white flour in my mix of flours that I'm using for feeding. Those bubbles are an indicator of how much gas is being trapped as a byproduct of fermentation. While I don't think it's necessary that the bubbles be large and huge caverns in your sourdough starter, it is an important thing to know that your sourdough starter is rising and falling to some degree throughout the day. In terms of aroma, you'll notice that when you first feed your sourdough starter, depending on the grain that you're using, it might smell a little sweet, a little grassy. And as it ferments through the day, it'll become progressively more sour and vinegar-like. When your sourdough starter goes too far, it'll smell extremely pungent and it'll almost kind of shock your nose in kind of a fingernail polish way. I often get the question about what a good sourdough starter should smell like. And the answer is it's always going to be kind of different. It really depends on the makeup of your starter, what grain you're using. I find for my sourdough starter, the aroma kind of changes through the day from grassy and sweet all the way until like a ripe cheese, kind of musty and strong smell towards the end of its refreshment cycle. So let's look at an example. Here is my ripe sourdough starter. Lots of bubbles on top, and if I pull some back below as well. The consistency is loose but not overly watery, and the aroma here would be strong but not overwhelmingly pungent. At this point, it needs a feeding, or I could use it for baking. Over the past 10 plus years that I've maintained my sourdough starter, I've kind of learned to read all of these signs together, the aroma and the visual characteristics, and also the textural changes. And all these things together help me determine when my sourdough starter needs a refreshment or a feeding. So my best advice is to kind of pay attention to your sourdough starter each time you feed it. Take notice of the season, the temperature in your kitchen, and start to build up this intuition for how your starter is progressing through the day, when it needs a feeding, and how your bread turns out when you're maintaining your sourdough starter in this way. Using baker's percentages helps you get an immediate intuitive understanding of what components comprise your sourdough starter, and it might also give you an understanding for how long it will take to ripen. All the ingredients are related to the total flour in the recipe. And when it comes to sourdough starters, we use the exact same terminology to help us understand exactly what ingredients we're putting in at each feeding. So if I give my sourdough starter 100 grams of flour at each feeding and 100 grams of water, that means that my sourdough starter is at 100% hydration. That's because there is as much water as there is flour. We talk about the sourdough starter carryover in just the same way. So each time I feed my sourdough starter, I discard it down to some amount left in the jar. Let's say the amount is 20 grams. If I give it 100 grams of flour at each feeding, that 20 grams is 20%. Now that carryover percentage might change for me depending on the season. If it's summer, I might drop that 20 grams of sourdough starter down to 5 if I find that my sourdough starter is ripening too fast. If it's winter and things are going super slow because it's cold in my kitchen, I might increase that 20 grams to 30 grams. So the amount of sourdough starter that I leave in the jar has a big implication on how fast my sourdough starter ripens. The more I leave, the faster it ripens. The less I leave, the slower it ripens. For example, if my carryover is 20 grams, or 20% in my case, then I know that at the temperature I usually keep my sourdough starter at, and the flour that I use, it'll ripen in about 12 hours. If you kept your starter at the same temperature as I did and used the same flour, but you left 30 or 40 or even 50%, that means your sourdough starter will ripen faster. And so you start to build up this intuitive sense for how much starter is left in the jar, what season it might be, and what temperature your starter is kept at, and how fast it'll ripen. Now, these ratios are not set in stone, and they should be adjusted based on the flour and temperature in your kitchen. So if your starter ripens too fast, you might want to leave less sourdough starter in the jar each time. So instead of 20%, for example, let's say you go down to 10%. Or in the summer, when it's super warm and it might be even hotter in your kitchen, you might go all the way down to 5%. So always feel free to adjust the ratios of your sourdough starter as needed to fit your schedule and the season you're in and your environment that you're in. None of these things are set in stone, and they should be changed and optimized to work with your schedule and the style of bread baking that you do. A common question I get from sourdough bakers is, hey, I forgot to refresh or feed my sourdough starter when I was supposed to this morning, and I couldn't get to it until way later that evening. Did I do something wrong? Is my starter gonna die, or do I have any issues? And the answer is no. Your sourdough starter is super resilient. The microbes that are in your sourdough starter want to continue to live, and they will survive in just about any case and with lots and lots of neglect. So just give your sourdough starter a feeding at the next opportunity and get it back onto schedule, and it'll be just fine. Why do we even have to feed our sourdough starter? Why can't we just leave it on the counter, take it out occasionally, put it away, and not worry about it for a week or 2 weeks until we're ready to bake again? Well, the answer is that our sourdough starter is actually a living and breathing thing. It's made up of a mix of wild yeast and bacteria, and they coexist in this symbiotic relationship, and they depend on the food that we provide it for survival. The food that we give it is flour. The starches in flour are used by the bacteria and yeast for fermentation. So if we didn't provide flour to our sourdough starter for a long time and left it on the counter at room temperature, eventually the byproducts of fermentation, and specifically the acid generated during fermentation, would make that mixture inhospitable and eventually start to weaken our sourdough starter. So getting on a predictable and consistent feeding routine for your sourdough starter ensures that it is healthy and is strong, and that always translates to better bread in the kitchen. Because there are so many variables to baking bread, locking down your sourdough starter and getting it into a predictable and consistent feeding routine really helps to go a long way to making sure that your bread is the best it can be. So I hope this video has given you a good set of ideas for how to take this back to maintaining your own sourdough starter. Or if you're just creating one right now, you can come back to this video and you'll have a good path forward for maintaining your starter. Have a look here for my latest sourdough video, and if there's anything specific you'd like to learn about when it comes to sourdough bread baking or sourdough starter maintenance, leave a comment below. And until the next one, happy baking.